who am I? I've been working in helping companies secure their IoT products for over a decade now. My background is actually in pay TV, so we started with security there, which is quite complex. Some of our clients, we work with small startups to global multinationals, as you can quite obviously see from this. I'll explain this a bit more in a bit. What I can talk about, obviously, is our market areas. So we cover a wide range of markets. At first sight, they look quite diverse in terms of security. So we're a very technical organization. So we work right from even silicon level itself. So we'll put countermeasures into silicon chips, so microprocessors, for instance, all the way up to full large-scale systems, access control systems, medical devices. Now, the approach we take to most of these is quite similar. I'll go on to that too. Obviously, the different areas themselves have differing degrees of things like the amount of regulation in them, the formalities required, and stuff like that. But one of the things all these have in common is that companies coming to them for the first time for security really struggle, actually. And that's a lot of what we do. We, as well as working on regular technical security stuff, we work a lot with companies who are brand new into security. And it's interesting to see the disconnect between the security world and security practitioners and the companies themselves. So the good news, so from our observations, about 10 years ago, customers come to us and say, we've been hacked, our device has been hacked, what can you do? And of course, we normally say, sorry, your hardware isn't good enough, or we need to do a lot to change your software. So where are we now? Well, we now get this a lot more. We've designed a product. How can we make it secure? Yeah, obvious design flaws. And it's a good indication, because if they come to us at this stage, normally what we have to do is say, yes, you've got the principles right, probably, but obviously we'll need to make some hardware changes or something like that, and it's still expensive. So, not too late. Where we want to get to, obviously, with IoT companies is how can we build it in right from the start? And we're not there yet, but it's something we definitely want to achieve. We do get a lot of comments saying, why is security so slow going into these big organizations? They can produce stuff. Why can't they do it securely? And from a security, community perspective, there's a lot of frustration sometimes. But as sort of last speaker also mentioned, manufacturers have a lot to worry about. So they traditionally made devices, possibly mechanical ones. They then had to integrate some electronics. But in the last sort of number of years, they've had to go well beyond that. They've had to put in cloud support. They've had to put app support, which always involves new chips, for instance, going in, new processors, new software, new cloud applications, new apps. It's a massive amount for them to learn. New wireless technology. Yep, it's a lot to add in. And then on top of that, of course, it's all security. And skills, as the last person mentioned. Skills are really short in this area. So actually getting all of this in, getting a product up to a decent IoT security standard is difficult. And there's also a mismatch about how we all see security in terms of the security community and how a manufacturer would see security. So we see it as nice and ordered, lots of processes and standards. Manufacturers see it slightly differently. Generally, anyone that we first approach, they said, well, they don't speak our language, for a start. Security is, not common. I've heard this from our customers, actually, referring it to the security black hole or security pit, which they see immediately. As soon as security comes up, they go, ooh, money. It's going to suck in money. It's going to suck in time, resources. Might delay us getting to market. And that has a big impact, particularly for things like consumer companies who have to make money. So it's no wonder that security isn't obviously their central view of things. And then they have their first look at security. So if you take a medical device manufacturer, so this is from the current EU medical device regulation, which will be coming in the next few years. And they get, wording like this, where they have to do their software according to state-of-the-art sort of risk management. And really, when they start looking at this, they go, oh, right, first thing is we have to do security stuff. Right, security has to go in there. So, and that's when they start going into the security rabbit hole. They go, obvious questions, what stuff? What do we need to do? How much stuff? Well, how can I do this stuff? And is the stuff right when we've done it? So at this point, well, every industry tends to have standards, so they might go and look at standards as well, if they don't have regulation particularly. And again, they'll hit things like this, apart from going round and round and round with their standards, jumping from one standard to another, and inevitably coming back to the first standard you started with. And they still get things like this, some security jargon, and then organizations determine the form of risk assessment conducted, And the first thing is, again, how does that help us, Some industries are better, so some markets are better than others in being more prescriptive, but there's a lot of them that, for a company coming in the first time, is quite vague. So they generally go round and round and round until they come to the point of, right, let's go and get help. And this is a bit where I was alluding at the start. Security companies actually communicating is difficult because we're so bound by a lot of things like non-disclosure agreements. So for companies to find the correct company to help them can be quite difficult. And this is where the IOTSF actually helps quite a bit. But it's still difficult for them. So I guess the next sort of part of the talk is how do we, as an organization, lead our customers through this? So I'm going to go through this sort of consumer case. We've used it in other types as well, but generally the first thing we need to get them aware of is preparation for this. And these are stuff that every security professional, is generally very aware of. But again, these customers aren't. They're not used to doing this. They're not used to thinking in our language. They're not used to putting stuff together in a way that answers the questions that we said earlier. So we have to get them to think about what they want to protect, their valuable property. And that's harder than you think, because a lot of companies don't actually have a very firm view on that, in our experience. And then, of course, others' valuable property as well. And for that, they need to understand their supply chain and stakeholders, especially going up from them. And again, when you come into a company and start talking to them, they find that difficult to put together. And then, of course, there's things they have to protect. So usually driven by regulations and third-party requirements or licensing conditions, for instance. So, like I say, it's actually quite difficult. We sit down with the customers, walk through, and it's difficult for them to sometimes actually be able to understand what they find valuable, which is pretty critical to security. The other thing is threat actors. So to sort of help answer the question, how much protection does a product need, they need to understand who's going to attack it. And again, with no security expertise, it's like, well, we don't know. It could be criminals, could be, So a lot of time we have to educate them on this. Deliberate ones, they can get usually pretty quickly. Accidental threat sources, they struggle with that one quite a lot, actually. And again, they have to look at the whole process, what can go wrong when they're building the products. And obviously then we have to explain that there are some parameters that we can associate with these threat actors, like motivation or capability and resources. And these can actually help bound the types of attack and start to answer the questions that they had originally. So particularly the how much stuff, so we can start to address that problem. So in terms of sort of things that we do at a practical level, one of the ways we approach the problem, and we find really good with companies, is to go through their life cycle of their product. Now, companies, they all understand this very well, how their product generally is going to be manufactured, developed, produced, distributed, used, and they have a good idea of the life cycle of it. And then at each point of that life cycle, we can say, right, let's see your use cases for it. And again, a lot of companies already have these existing. So we're able to use quite a lot from a top level down, start working with misuse cases. Again, pretty well understood technique, but it works really good with companies who are just starting off with this, because visually they can start to see the threats as well. And this sort of starts to answer the question, how do I do this stuff? So there's two ways of looking at the whole threat sort of system as well. So you can look from the top down, and the use cases are good for that. Or of course we can look from the bottom up, and this is where the previous talk as well goes into analyzing all the different components of the system. So we can have our threat actor, uses vulnerabilities to attack an asset. But of course the other thing for a new company is how do I figure out what those vulnerabilities are in the first place? So to generate this whole sort of threat. And as we saw in the last one, we find the Stride analysis works really well for companies. Again, we work in the technical level. So engineers, for instance, tend to have reasonable idea of things like data flows in the products, how everything fits together, how data is processed and transferred. And Stride analysis is something where we can look at each point on the data flow and say, okay, is it subject to one of these conditions, for instance, that typical attack classes, like spoofing or tampering, information leakage or anything like that. And this is something they can understand and grasp quite well. And it's great to get engineers starting to think about the problem as well. Again, this fits into how can I do this stuff? So the other thing that we like to work with the companies with is how can you use this information further to answer some of the other questions? So the output from the threat modeling can obviously be used for risk analysis. So we have our threats, the risks arise from those. They generally understand that there is an impact and probability, that not every risk is equal. And we can then introduce them into risk models. So how do you go from a threat to risk, and how do you order the risk? So explaining how to use quantitative sort of numerical models. So something like DREAD or CVSS works well for software. And this is where you assign a number to a particular aspect of the risk. Something like, can it be easily reproduced, which is something that they're obviously very wary about. What damage will it inflict, level of damage. Again, you have to be careful at this point, because quite a few of these are quite subjective, especially if you go into the qualitative models, where in this case you assign levels like impact, high, medium, low, or probability, high, medium, low, and then put in a matrix to try and derive a risk level. So it's really important to work together to try and make sure that the customer is completely aligned with how you are categorizing your risks, and make sure they agree that the risks are, at the levels that you put them down to be. So by putting this sort of model in place, we can prioritize them. Again, that works very well because it helps them to understand too what things they should be addressing first. And for companies, practically, they have to implement stuff. And they want to implement them to get the best bang for the buck, really. So risk prioritization really helps there. Next thing we have to look at is, okay, you've got your high priority risks, the ones that are within the level of risk that they're prepared to accept. And we put the controls in place. And this is where things like the IOTSF framework comes in. The latest version of it's very much risk-driven. And a lot of the tables in it are essentially controls. So you can put this in front of somebody and say, look, here's a list of security patterns, if you want to call them that, existing, that can be used to control these particular risks. And again, that's something they can see how it relates to a real system, and they can start to use it. And again, helps them deal with the question, how much stuff? Requirements. A lot of companies obviously understand requirements, particularly the ones who already deal heavily in requirement-regulated industries, automotive, medical, for instance. So the threat analysis, obviously, we can use to generate security goals. So for instance, you might have a security goal that says all data between particular points should be kept confidential. Say there's a privacy risk or something. And they're broad, there's no specific implementation there. And then they have their existing functional requirements. And this is particularly in the case when companies come to us in that middle stage where they have a product already developed and they want us to analyze it. They generally do have the functional requirements as well. In that case, we can say, okay, we've generated some security goals. You have your functional requirements. We can use them as constraints to get your security requirements. So for instance, their functional requirement is they must transfer data from A to B. As we said, our security one, it must transfer from A to B confidentially. So the security requirement might end up being transfer from A to B using AES encryption. So in that case, we can get narrow and, very importantly, testable. Because what we want to do is then go on to the next stage of answering the question, is this stuff right? Because when they get to this stage and they start to implement stuff, having security requirements means at the end they can test against it as well. So it's a very practical, useful approach. Okay, so in summary, what we're seeing over the last 10 years is security awareness is growing. I mean, there's a lot of talk about companies ignoring it. Some small ones do, but all the reputable companies that we see do want to develop secure products. Starting is very difficult for companies. You know, when they're thrown into the security world for the first time, it's difficult. Especially, you know, even the ones who are used to regulation. I mean, we've worked with quite a few medical device companies. Of course, used to do standalone devices and now want to do connected devices. And the regulations from security, they really don't know where to start. So it's difficult for them. It takes time. I mean, in the security community, we have to understand that there are lots of other stuff being done. These companies have to remain competitive as well while they're doing all of this evolution into security. And the security has a massive impact on their business because not only is it coming into their development, their organization, their engineering teams, their manufacturing, it can have impacts on, for instance, manufacturing times on the manufacturing product lines, which is a big monetary impact. Distribution updates, all of this they have to worry about, and it's a huge task. So it's no wonder it's taking so long, really. Gradual process. From our engagements, what we tend to see is it's almost like a pattern when companies are starting to put in security. So they'll generally secure an existing design, is the first step. And then the security will move sort of closer and closer to the original sort of start of design cycle as they go through more and more products and they get confident in it. They'll then start to own it a lot more, and that's when we see it starting to distribute through the organization a lot more. Then they'll come eventually to realize that security is not just a one-off. It is a life. It's a continuous activity. So it's for life and not just for a Christmas IoT SF conferences. So.